as you mentioned, this is work with Sam Gershman and Haley Dorfman, who is now a postdoc with Liz Phelps at Harvard. So let's see if I can move my slides. Meet Anne. Anne is going to a party, and she is a little pessimistic by nature. And so she doesn't expect things to generally go well, but she decides to tell a joke, and everybody laughs, and they laugh. Anne thinks very cruelly at her, and Anne is sad, and she decides to never go to another party again. Meet Bob. Bob goes to a party. Bob is kind of optimistic by nature, so he thinks that things generally go fairly well. So he decides to tell a joke, and everybody laughs, and Bob thinks, wow, they're laughing at my joke. Bob is cool. I love this, and I'm going to the next party again. Now, Anne and Bob basically had the exact same experience. They saw the same data, and yet they interpreted that in totally different ways. This is important for a number of reasons, right? It clearly affects their propensity to take risks in the future. It affects whether they're going to go out and have that experience again and possibly disconfirm their initial beliefs. But because they had these different expectations to begin with, they end up interpreting that data in different ways. Now, what happened here is basically a confirmation bias. And if you Google confirmation bias, you'll see a lot of figures that look like this, where it means what you see is basically the intersection between the objective facts and what confirms your prior beliefs here. So confirmation bias, it gets a very bad rap. Some say it's the best known and most widely accepted notion of inferential error to come out of the literature on human reasoning. And it's been blamed for closed-mindedness in fields as hopefully important and broad as science, medicine, politics, law. So people hate confirmation bias, right? They think this is this terrible, nefarious, pernicious kind of bias that we should never have. But what if confirmation bias could actually be adaptive? What if it could have some useful value to it? And if you think of it from a statistical perspective, from a Bayesian perspective, it could actually make sense. That is to say, when you're faced with some uncertain or ambiguous stimulus, it makes sense that you should interpret those in light of your prior beliefs. So if you think of it in computer science terms, they might call it an inductive bias, right? Something that helps you to jumpstart your learning process. So we have some reason to think that actually it could be adaptive. And we've seen this in a few different domains so far. So some have studied confirmation bias that might be adaptive in the way we acquire information. That is, do we seek out information that confirms our pre-existing hypotheses? Or in the interpretation of perceptual data. So when you have ambiguous perceptual stimuli, how do we interpret those given our prior beliefs? We're looking at the processing of reward feedback. Now, so far, there's only been a little work on what are called choice confirming asymmetries. And so that reflects how people seem to place greater weight on positive outcomes for actions that they chose and less weight on positive outcomes for actions that they didn't choose. So the sort of counterfactual outcomes here. We're looking at something different. We're looking at how you appraise these ambiguous outcomes themselves, irrespective of whether that's what you chose or what you didn't choose. So more like our Anne-Bob situation to begin with. And we're going to provide two things here. We're going to have a new model and we're going to have a new task. So we have two goals here. First, we want to figure out, is the way that we interpret ambiguous rewarding outcomes, if that's confirmation biased, is that potentially adaptive? And second, can we connect these biases to individual differences? And in particular, we'll look at differences in one's optimistic disposition. Now, this relates to a number of literatures, and we're particularly looking at a setting where you have what we call valence ambiguity. And that means The magnitude of the outcome is something that you know, but you're not sure about the valence. You don't know whether it was good or bad. Right? And this is just like that Ann Bob situation where you saw there was some response, some event that happened where everybody laughed, but you weren't sure whether that was in a good way or a bad way. And so this links with a few different literatures. One that has to do with the way that we encode valence and magnitude perhaps separately in the brain. Also, there's neuroscientific work and clinical work on the way that we process ambiguous rewards. And valence ambiguity in particular has been studied in the context of emotion processing. So if I show you a face of somebody who's surprised, was that a good surprise or a bad surprise? Right? Were they surprised because of some positive experience or a negative experience? And the way that we interpret ambiguous outcomes has also been linked to clinical traits and clinical outcomes. So, for example, people who are anxious tend to have what's called negative interpretation bias, where they tend to read into these negative stimuli, negative faces, negative experience, or ambiguous stimuli and experiences in a more negative fashion. So we have two contributions here. First is we are providing a new multi-armed bandit task, a new experimental paradigm to incorporate valence ambiguity. And second, we're proposing a new Bayesian computational model of how you maybe should learn under this valence ambiguity. And it captures this idea that you have almost a Bayesian missing data imputation. That is to say, if you know part of something, like the magnitude of some outcome, and you have some prior beliefs, you should use that to actually guide your assessment of what the valence is. So the way that you fill in the blanks should be consistent with Bayesian statistical principles here. So in our experimental paradigm, we turn to the Wild West, as we've done before in a previous paper. And in this task, people are in the role of gold miners in the Wild West. So this is a very an interesting way of presenting a classic multi-armed bandit paradigm that's been used in a number of different fields here. So participants are in the role of this miner where they have two different gold mines that they can choose to dig from. So in a given trial, they have to pick one of these. Once they pick one, they get an outcome here. So they pick the one on the left and we show them, you got a reward of plus 10, which translates into a positive amount of money for them. And we show that here as you got 10 units of gold. So gold is good. We also show them the counterfactual outcome here. So that's, in this case, if you picked the other mine, you would have gotten minus 11 points. We did this so that we can shut off any exploration exploitation and just focus on interpretation of these outcomes and learning here. So you took the action, you got the outcome, and then you go back through this again and again, right? A classic reinforcement learning type approach. So far, that's pretty standard. Here's the modification we're making. On some trials, when you dig, you get something that looks like this. And this is dirty ore. It's an ambiguous outcome where you know that this was 6 units of something, but you don't know whether it was gold or rocks because it's covered in dirt. And you'll still get paid at the end of the task based on whether it was in fact gold or rocks, but you will not be told which of those it is. And that means you have to make your best guess based on any information you have to date, any prior pre-existing beliefs, as well as the magnitude of what's given to you here. And again, you get the counterfactual outcome. It was about 50% of the trials where we give them these ambiguous outcomes, and always for the option that they chose. And then we asked them, do you think that this was rocks or gold? So we had a stated belief question here, and that tells us more specifically what actually were your beliefs about this ambiguous stimulus. Now, in order to try and influence their prior beliefs going into a particular round, we started off each block by putting them into this sort of virtual saloon. And in the saloon, they encountered a cowboy who told them that he'd heard a rumor that maybe there's a lot of gold in this terrain, right? It might be a very rich environment. Or he said, well, he heard a rumor that there were a lot of rocks, not really a great place. Or he didn't really hear anything. He's not really sure here. So this is a neutral condition. So we can try and influence them a bit to say it's a rich, a poor, or a neutral environment. We didn't actually change the reward statistics here. It was always the case that one mine had an average value of +10, the other ones had a value of -10, and then there was just some common noise across the actual outcome that they would receive in any given round. So we held the context itself or the environment fixed, but we just tried to change their pre-existing beliefs a little bit. So just to reiterate, we said that in each block, first they were in the saloon, they were given some pre-existing belief a little bit, then they were given a choice of the mines to dig from, they got the feedback and made a judgment about whether they thought the outcome was rocks or gold, and then they cycled back to part B, the choice here, and went through that again. And then after about a handful of trials, they would go back into another condition where they were given a different pre-existing belief here. So in our model, this is built on a Bayesian reinforcement learning model. So the standard Rescorla-Wagner model, this is the most basic version of model-free reinforcement learning. It says that you update your estimate of rewards by taking your initial estimate, and then you increase that based on this reward prediction error, which is the difference between the outcome that you actually got minus your pre-existing estimate, and scale that by some learning rate that says, well, how much are you adjusting based on that new data? Now, if you have a Bayesian version of this, then that learning rate is itself derived from optimal statistical principles. And so the weight that you place on your prior beliefs versus the data is basically a reflection of how much uncertainty there is in each of these relative to one another. So if you have very, very vague pre-existing beliefs, that means your estimate variance here is quite high. You're going to update more towards the data because you didn't really know much to start with. Now, to this point, this is a standard Bayesian reinforcement learning model. This is the Kalman filter from engineering. But when we look at our paradigm with ambiguous outcomes, well, now there are some points here which are actually not so clear, right? What does it mean to have a given outcome that's ambiguous? If I told you you got 10 units of this dirty ore, should you count that as +10? Should you count that as -10? Should it be 0? Should you ignore it? Should it be somewhere in between? Where exactly, if so? And so we say you're going to impute that ambiguous outcome with basically your best guess, your mean expectation of that reward, given the magnitude of it. So if you think that this magnitude, given you got a +10, if you think that tends to be more likely to be positive than negative, then you're going to treat it as somewhere in the middle of -10 and +10, but skewed more towards the +10 side. And you can calculate that more precisely given the Bayesian machinery, which I just won't go into very much here. The other thing that you need to do is to change the uncertainty about the outcome here as well, because it's not only the signal noise that says how different each outcome is in a given trial from the true mean. You also have some further uncertainty caused by the ambiguity from the coarsening of whether it was positive or negative here as well. And so you can see that that's maximally uncertain when you're totally unsure, 50-50 guess as to whether it was a positive or negative outcome here. And it happens to be scaled by the reward because you can think how if you got an outcome of like 0 or 1, you know that it's basically +1 or -1. You know that it's almost the same. It doesn't really matter. But if it's +100 or -100, now you're really, really unsure, and you should factor that in. And I should mention this model is actually approximately Bayesian. We did what's called assumed density filtering, which basically projects everything onto a Gaussian space because it makes the math work out really nicely. And that's a lot easier than doing it other ways. So what did we actually find here? Well, first, the Bayesian model fit these learning curves fairly well. So people were learning in the task, and this was captured by any of these kinds of models that we would use here. We also looked at the stated beliefs, right? Remember, that was when we asked them, did you think that this outcome was rocks or gold? And of course, can you see my mouse cursor here? Cool. So of course, if there's gold, this is a nice attention check. We know that everybody said it was gold, and if it was rocks, barring some noise, you said it was rocks. But in those dirty outcomes, people basically said, well, if they were in that rich condition where they got the rumor of gold into this environment, they had higher stated beliefs in gold. And if they were in the poor condition, then they had lower stated beliefs. Neutral, oddly, seems to be pretty close to the rich condition, actually. And these little circles here represent the model predictions of a Bayesian model where we fit condition-specific prior beliefs here. So the Bayesian model was able to capture these differences in stated beliefs across conditions as well. Now, this is not model predictions here. This is just the data itself, and this is pretty neat. If you look at these dotted lines here, these dotted lines here reflect the true prevalence of gold in each trial here. That is to say, given the option you chose, how likely was that to actually be gold? And this is increasing with experience because you're just getting better at the task, right? You're actually learning, this is the better mind to pick. I'm going to pick that more often. That's why this increases here. What's cool is that these solid lines represent the stated beliefs that people had. And in this neutral condition, this gray line, their stated beliefs track the actual true probabilities really closely. That's to say, if we didn't kind of push them in one direction or another, their stated beliefs are pretty accurate compared to the true values. Now, the other neat thing is, well, we did see differences between these conditions. So when we said, well, it's a bit rich, then they are at a higher belief state here. And when it's poor, it was somewhat lower. But in particular, that obtains more at the start rather than the finish. So it's almost as if they have different prior beliefs induced by this manipulation, but with experience, they're actually converging to the truth here. So that's kind of neat, right? This is consistent with some idea of confirmation bias and optimism as being prior beliefs that are then influenced by the data as well. And it turns out that if we fit that Bayesian model with different prior means for each condition, you could actually capture those differences across conditions. That is to say, you end up with differences in those beliefs at the very beginning, but then those end up washed out with the experience that you're getting because that experience is pretty comparable with that. So the Bayesian model is capturing these stated belief dynamics fairly well here. It turns out the best fitting model does seem to vary somewhat across individuals, but across the board, the Bayesian version of the model fit better than a more traditional Rescorla-Wagner reinforcement learning model that just skipped those ambiguous outcomes here. Now, can we look at differences across individuals, right? We saw that there are these prior differences in beliefs when we vary experimentally people's beliefs. But what about individual trait differences? And so we looked at optimism using this well-known life orientation test revised, the LOTR. And this is pretty well known and commonly used in clinical psychology to capture optimism. And it's been linked to a lot of well-known positive life and health outcomes. So it's been linked to how healthy you are in terms of certain kinds of diseases and in terms of how happy you tend to be. So you can see how this has a link between, well, in things like uncertain times, I usually expect the best. This is a very clear link, at least intuitively, to how you're going to interpret these ambiguous outcomes. And so we found, in fact, that if we take the average stated belief in gold on those ambiguous trials, that is positively correlated with their optimism level. That is to say, optimists believe that these ambiguous outcomes tend to be positively rewarding here. And it's not that there was any difference across them in terms of their objective accuracy, that was pretty much uncorrelated, only in terms of their subjective beliefs here. So optimists, in fact, were attributing these ambiguous outcomes with more positive valence, in effect. So there's more that we're digging into still, but in summary, we showed this or developed this task that measured learning and beliefs about these ambiguous outcomes in this context of valence ambiguity. We found that this observed confirmation bias seemed to be consistent with Bayesian mechanisms, which is important for demonstrating that's adaptive in the sense that the stated beliefs seem to be accurate. They were connected closely to the true probabilities. We also found that the Bayesian model could provide an adequate fit of this data. And we're still trying to look into this more, but it could be consistent with this idea that's been proposed of optimism as priors, right? So your optimism determines your prior beliefs here, which could then be minimized with the data that you're getting here. But we're still looking into this. But it provides some support for the idea that confirmation bias in these reinforcement learning type settings could actually be adaptive, and we provide a paradigm and a model that helps us to explore this idea. So that's my talk, and I'm happy to take any questions to the extent we have time for it.